Hotel. My name is Molefi Kete Asante, and I just want to have a conversation with you about the U.S. Census. I call it a white supremacist evolution because it's extremely important that we understand the history of the census itself. Let me start by giving a context. The practice of conducting a periodic census began in Kemet in the second millennium BC, where it was used for tax gathering and to determine the fitness of young men for military services. And so the censuses in Kemet, or Egypt, first appear around 1900 BC and became normal as a tradition in the New Kingdom around 1400 BCE. According to Herodotus, the Greek writer of the 5th century BC, he says the country required every Egyptian to declare annually to the governor of a province how he gained his living. So that's what censuses were for. I mean, this is the aim, the fundamental basis of gathering data about the citizens of a country. The United States Census began in 1790, and it was the first census of the whole U.S. And now the whole U.S. at that time was only 13 states plus 4 districts. And the 4 districts were Kentucky, Tennessee, Maine, and Vermont. It recorded the population of the United States on August the 2nd, 1790. And it was mandated by Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution. It's important for us to sort of set this context because the first census was born with 2 defects. The first was a counting of an African person as 3/5 of a white man. And then the second was the prohibition against counting native people, the First Nations people. So they didn't count Africans fully, and they didn't count Native Americans. Enslaved Africans were not mentioned in the census by name, by age, sex, or ethnic origin. We were only identified under the name of the slaveholder. That was the first census, 1790. At 17.8%, the 1790 census proportion of Africans to the white population was the highest ever recorded by any census of the U.S. That's almost 18% of the U.S. population that was counted. Native Americans were not counted. We now range, 13 to 14%. But at the highest, we were almost 18% of the U.S. population. South Carolina was a state with 43% of black people lived in, the people in South Carolina were black, 43%. Virginia had 39%. Georgia, 35%. Maryland, 32%. North Carolina, 25%. These were the states. In 1790, that was the breakdown. Of course, we didn't have Alabama and Mississippi. When you count those now, of course, you would see that they would also be in the top 10 of the number of African Americans compared to the rest of the population. Now, the 2020 U.S. Census has several categories, but there are 2 categories that I really want to pay close attention to, and that's the Black or African American category and the white category, and I'll just mention the others. The category Black or African American includes, according to the census, all individuals who identify with one or more nationalities or ethnic groups originating in any of the Black racial groups of Africa. Examples of these include, but are not limited to, African American, Jamaican, Haitian, Nigerian, Ethiopian, Somali. The category also includes, they say, Ghanaians, South Africans, Barbadians, Kenyans, Liberians, and Bahamians. Now, this is quite interesting. Uh, uh, very, very powerfully so, and we'll come back to it. But this idea of any of the black racial groups of Africa, as if there are other racial groups originating in Africa. If there are people in Africa who are not African, who are not black, then those people are actually people who are either descendants of invaders, or there are people who have traveled from outside of the continent of Africa back, rather into Africa. It's just like if you were going to do a category of Europe, and you say people, individuals who identify with one or more nationalities or ethnic groups originating in any of the white racial groups of Europe. You were like, wait a minute, what do you mean by that? Europe is essentially a white continent. Now, there are Africans living in Europe, but the Africans who live in Europe are not originated in Africa, you see? So that's a problematic number one. Now, you wonder who made up these census categories. The category white, they say, includes all individuals who identify with one or more nationalities or ethnic groups originating in Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. Examples of these include, but are not limited to, German, Irish, English, Italian, Lebanese, Egyptian, what? Polish, French, Iranian, Slavic, Cajun, and Chaldean. Now, this is problematic, but this is why I told you that it's a white supremacist evolution, because this concept of race, number one, is problematic, but how they have defined it shows you that this is a problem. White groups, individuals who identify with one or more nationalities, are groups originating in Europe, the Middle East. There is no continent Middle East, number one. Uh, you have to say Southwest Asia, or you have to say North Africa. But to say Middle East and North Africa, that is not correct. And the notion of Middle East is not really a good term. It's a political term. It is probably best to say Southwest Asia, and to put North Africa there, and then to include Egyptians as white is going to be even more confusing, as I will explain. Then the other categories are the Asian category, the American Indian category, the Asian category includes all individuals who identify with one or more nationalities or ethnic groups uh, originating in the Far East. And that is also a very stupid statement, the Far East. What do you mean the Far East? Far from what? If people lived in China, I mean, what would be the Far East to the Chinese? This is not correct. This is not a good way to start the situation when you start talking about the people of Asia. And of course, the categories have to be questioned too. You would wonder, you would think that whoever is doing the U.S. Census ought to at least have a conversation with people who are from these various ethnic groups to get some idea of what they're talking about. Then they have one called the American Indian or Alaska Native. And those are individuals from North and South America who originated in these places, um, and include Alaska Native, different ethnic groups, Navajo, instead of Diné, they should have said Diné, which is the correct name of the Navajo. They should have said Lakota and so forth, and so forth, and so on, all right? Uh, and then, of course, we know that the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, they have these as a different racial group. They call this The groups, they are people like Fijians, Tongans, people from native Hawaii's, people who are from Tahiti, um, Chokisa, Sapanese, Yapese, and so forth. So that's a whole category. They're not Asians. They are Pacific Islanders or Native Hawaiians. That's how they have begun to explain that particular group. So this just shows you that the census is a political uh, instrument. And in 1790, they only counted what they call free whites. And the so-called free whites, who basically the white men who own a property, including Africans, they were counted. And so the enslaved people were counted as belonging to these free whites. And we were counted, of course, as I said earlier, 3/5 of the white person. By 1820, when they did the census, they did add a category called free colored people, not just the ones who were enslaved, but by now, 1820, they're Africans who are definitely a community who were free. And these free colored people were now also included in the census. By 1850, they included people by, they call the African people, they say, by if you have black blood, if you're a mulatto, for example, that was on census. And then by 1870, they put the Chinese national origin on census. If you were Chinese, because the Chinese had come, many of the Chinese had even come around the 1850s, maybe 1849, the whole gold rush thing. The California brought a lot of Chinese into the West Coast. They even built the railroads in the western part of the United States. So they had to include, you got all these Chinese. So in 1870, they had to include the Chinese. By 1890, they had to include Native Americans. For the first time, they started including Native Americans. This is after they had had this incredible campaign to basically wipe out the Native Americans, to kill as many as they could. I mean, immediately after the Civil War, Sherman was used as a general to go out and to kill the buffalo on the plains. And not only that, but to put as many Native Americans in reservations as he could. And many of these people died because they were given blankets for the winter that was made, that was infected with smallpox. So this was all 1890. 1890, they also included another class of black people called octoroon and quadroon. Those categories were included as a part of the census. In 1910, they had taken out by 1890, 1900, they had taken out octoroon, quadroon. They put mulatto back in 1910, mulatto. In 1930, they made the Mexican a separate group. In 1950, they put the Hindu, uh, and rather they had the Hindu in the 1940s. They took the Hindu out and they took the Korean out from the census. This was the big discussion about whether people from India and people from Korea should be in the census. And they removed both, this is the beginning of the Korean War. They removed the Koreans and they removed the Hindu. In 1970, they introduced a category called Hispanic. And then in 2000, in the census, this shows you the census was a political document. It was used, the word Latino was used in 2000. So here's my problems. And there are several, but this just shows you in terms of an Afrocentric analysis how crazy and white supremacist this US Census is. Egyptian in the census under the category of white takes people of an African country and claim them as white, something that would not have happened in 1790 when the census started. It wouldn't even have happened in 1990. This is a deliberate attempt to confuse people and to claim Africa's classical civilization as a white civilization. Listen to this now. There is no reason to claim Egyptian in the census under the racial category white, because you're taking people of an African country and claiming them as white, something that would not have occurred in 1790. And I'm saying that part of this is brought because of the debate that we have brought to scholarship of the classical civilizations of the Nile Valley. And the idea in the minds of the white races is to try to figure out how to make the Nile Valley of Africa, which as far back as you go, the blacker it gets. They're trying to figure out how to make it a part of the white culture. Now, there's an interesting situation here, because it's true that Arabs right now dominate Egypt, but they didn't dominate Egypt historically. The Arabs only came to Egypt in the 7th century, this era, 7th century CE, current era, or AD. This is when you get the Arabs coming to Egypt. They came from Arabia. That's why they're called Arabs. They're not Africans. And they don't even see themselves often as Africans, you see? And the language is Arabic, which is not an African language. Language comes from Arabia. So why is the American census including Egyptians as white? Now, it's interesting to me that if they wanted to say Arabs, then that's a different thing. If they wanted to claim the Arabs as white, I mean, that's up to the Arabs. I mean, I don't have a problem with claiming the Arabs as white if they want to. But to say Egyptian is a confusing situation, because if you're talking about the native indigenous Egyptians who still live in Egypt, and there are some very black, very dark Egyptians living in Egypt, if you're talking about those people and you're claiming those people as white, then you are totally confused. So if you're saying Egyptian and you mean citizens of Egypt, just like if you say American and you mean citizens of the United States of America, citizens of Egypt could be of any ethnic background. You could have Americans of any ethnic background, Japanese, French, Italian, Nigerian, etc. So if you say Egyptian in a citizenship class, then you can say many of the Egyptians may be classified as white. And that may be true, because particularly if the Arabs accept that classification. So one could say that the Egyptian term, the word Egyptian, is like saying American. That's what I've said just now. An American be of any race, an Egyptian. The Egyptian race has always been, if you talk about the Egyptian race in ancient time, has always been black. It has never been white. In 2020, most of the people who live in Egypt are of Arab background, but the census form does not say Arab, it says Egyptian, which is not only a mistake, but a denial of Africa's own classical civilization and the African people who were ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians were not white. Today's Arabs in Egypt are not Africans. They are also not the people who built the pyramids, but rather those who came after General El-Az invaded Egypt in 639 AD. They came from Arabia with the religion of Islam and the language of Arabia, and assisted the Africans in defeating the Romans, and then they decided to stay. They neither spoke the Egyptian language nor identified with the black people of Egypt as Africans. To classify Arabs as white is fine with me, even if some Arabs are not confused or are confused, as I find, for example, in Sudan, Libya, and Egypt, because they do not honor their grandmothers. But to say Egyptian and not qualify it is a dangerous sport, and it's a dangerous game. So that's why I say that the census is a white supremacist document. The black people who still live in Egypt after thousands of years would not claim whiteness. They are citizens of Egypt, but not Arabs. Hence, they are Egyptians by citizenship and African by cultural origin. The issue of race itself has to be attacked in its status and its ranking foundation, because that's the problem. The problem is the attachment of ranking to this various notions of race and racial classification. So I submit this to you as part of critical thinking from an Afrocentric point of view. Hotep, and have a wonderful, beautiful day, and may the ancestors always bless you and give peace and joy to all of you, and may victory always be ours.